Wherever in Texas you go, you're gonna find just what you're looking for.
We're here with Jerry K. Green, a 1951 graduate of Louisville High School and a performer at this year's Talk This Way Festival. Now, Jerry, what was it like growing up in Louisville?
Well, it was a poor little small town then. When we moved here when I was 4 years old in 1936, the city population sign said 853. We increased it by 9 that day, the ones that hadn't gone off and married. And we grew up where the rodeo grounds is now. That's on my old 20-acre home place, Greenland Road, Greenland Hills. That's my home place. And everybody in town was poor. If anybody was wealthy at all, it was probably the Huffines. They had the wealthiest ones. They had the White House on Main Street that's probably still standing up there. Everybody else was poor, hard-time farmer, and it was rough. It was during the Great Depression.
Now, you said during your show that you got your interest in guitar and country singing when you were 10 when you saw a street performer out in Louisville. Tell us about that.
Right in front of the grocery store at the corner of what is now Mill Street. That was the old highway, the main highway from Dallas to Oklahoma back then, and it was the only paved road in town. And back then the farmers, this was, in the 40s, the farmers all around town came to town to do their shopping on Saturday afternoons. And country bands all over Texas and Oklahoma were sponsored by manufacturers of baking flour, to make your biscuits and all those things out of. And Bob Wills and the Light Crust Doughboys were one of them. And this one Saturday afternoon, I went to town. And in front of that store, it was on the northwest corner of Main Street and Mill, they call it now. I don't remember the name of the store at that time, because it's changed hands several times. But at that time, there was a car parked out in front with a platform on top. And it was advertising Gold Chain flour. And on top was a fellow with a guitar, mic and speakers, and he was singing to entertain them. They passed out sample biscuits, so he'd go in the store and buy some Gold Chain flour. That was Ernest Tubb. And the Tubb family, incidentally, has been in my life ever since, in my music life ever since. In '52, I ended up down in Austin, and Ernest's son Justin and 2 of his cousins were down there. We became friends in '60. Then I got drafted in '53, and Ernest had done a month-long tour of Korea for the Army at his own expense, and he arranged for me to be in Special Services entertainment section after I finished my basic and artillery training right after the war had ended, Korean War. And then in '66, I went to Nashville, and one of the Tubb cousins put me with the first publisher, in effect opened the first door on Music Row for me that led in a short time to a string of more than 40 performances on the Grand Ole Opry.
Now, when you were in high school, you were a part of a story that people talk about still in Louisville today when the fighting farmers chased down a bank robber in '47. What do you remember about that?
I remember, the football field was on the old gin lot, which was a block south of Main Street. And we were out there practicing football, and a lady came out on the balcony of the building that later became Whatley's store there on Main Street, and hollered something about she'd heard from the phone operator, I guess, that the bank had been robbed, and the guy was running down that road over back toward the gin. And I don't remember how it started. The football team took off after. It was just a field back there then, where they later, there was nothing out there then. And they caught up with him, and he dropped his sack of money and stuff and tried to get away, but they caught him. But I was a freshman at that time, and I remember being at the tail end of that. I was not the captor, but it was fun to see it in the papers, yeah.
Now, what's it like? Obviously, your first time in this building, the MCL Grand, but what's it like coming back to Louisville and performing in your hometown?
Well, it was exciting to me. In fact, a couple of my songs, as I say, my career got started here, and one of my songs is about that. And while singing, it choked me up to do it. A song called Ernest, Eddie, and Hank. I already told you about meeting Ernest Tubb here. And then I was in high school. I hitchhiked to Fort Worth to try to see Eddie Arnold. We didn't have money for anything. Didn't have a ticket, so the price, so I couldn't get in. 15 years later, that came around. 15 years later, in 1965, I was program director at KOKE radio station in Austin when Eddie Arnold had his another great big hit called Make the World Go Away, and we had him there as the star for the Austin Opera Festival. And so after not getting to see him in 1950, in 1965, I picked him up at the airport and took him to his hotel and dinner, and I emceed the show. So I got to meet him and his band leader, Bill Walker, who became a big producer in Nashville, and later in the 70s recorded my first and only 2 Billboard chart records, a fellow named Bill Walker. So it's quite interesting.
And then one more question for you. The song I guess people most associate with you is about Tripod, the three-legged dog. There's got to be a story behind that.
There is. I had, in order to survive a family, I had to put my music aside. Mostly I'd try to live without it when I could. I went to work for IBM in Houston. in 1962. And shortly thereafter, another fellow who had gone to the University of Texas too, named Bob Brock, invited me over to their house for dinner one night, get acquainted, I guess because I'd gone to Texas too, you know. And after supper, and he told me to bring my guitar, and after supper we were sitting in his den, and he had the old Lomax folk song book, and we were flipping through it, and I knew lots of parts of lots of old songs in from my own family background. I'm the baby of 11 kids, heard a lot of old folk songs. So we were flipping through, singing bits of any of the songs that I recognized, and this dog, Tripod, three-legged dog, was asleep on the hearth, and we were on like that for over an hour. And when we came to Goodnight Irene, the instant I started singing it, he woke up and jumped up and started singing it with me. I said something about it. He said, yeah, well, he always does that on that song. I said, he didn't do it on anything else. He said, no, he never does. Never has done it on anything else. And then I said, well, does he do anything else? And he went over and, so watch this, and he slid the back sliding door open out to the yard, and he hollered, I think he hollered squirrel, something. And there's a big old live oak, big old tree out in the backyard that grew up about 3 or 4 feet high and then slanted off. It looked like it was about 60 degrees. And Tripod ran out there like he was building up his speed, kind of circling, and he jumped up to where it started slanting off and ran up the thing like it was a sidewalk with 3 legs, right front leg missing, cut off at the shoulder. And then he said something else, and he jumped down and circled the yard like he was a guard or something. Anyway, I wrote a song about it and gave him a copy of it.
If you think you've got troubles you can't overcome, don't sit like a bump on a log. You can do twice as much if you try half as hard as Tripod, the three-legged dog.
And then it was 3 years later when I went to Nashville. I was as green as anybody that ever hit Nashville back then. I had my guitar and a box of lyrics. I had no tape recorder, anything, so I had no tapes. I just got with the tub boy and we sang, and he said, what'd you come? He was surprised to see me. He said, what are you doing here? And I said, I came to find out if I got anything as an artist or a writer. And he said, well, let's look at yourself. He was working, he knew publishers and had already written songs. I didn't even know at the time he had already written a hit song with Johnny Cash while we were out of contact. But he put me with a publisher who recorded the song, and less than 6 months later, I began that string of more than 40 performances on the Grand Ole Opry as a result of Tripod, the three-legged dog. And we have a couple of pictures. That was my first time on the Opry. It was my friend flew the dog to Nashville, let me have him. Everybody in Nashville wanted to see him. We were on TV shows and newspaper and all that. And so they let me take him on the Opry one time. They said, we don't use novelty acts on the Opry, so they considered that part being a novelty act. But then he went on to treat me like a regular member for a year until management changed.
Yeah, well, Jerry, thanks for coming out and performing today. We loved having you here. Jerry K. Green, a graduate of Louisville High School and country performer here at the MCL Grand for Chalk This Way.
If you think you've got troubles you can't overcome, don't sit like a bump on a log. You can do twice as much if you try half as hard as Tripod, the three-legged dog. My little dog has only 3 legs, but he never whimpers and he never begs. He doesn't know he's crippled, you see. From his point of view, he's got more legs than me. If you think you've got troubles you can't overcome, don't sit like a bump on a log. You can do twice as much if you try half as hard as Tripod, the three-legged dog.